cost to the worker. I have concerns, Mr. President, that type of person who knows nothing about offering meaningful work to people in ordinary times may gain advantage in COVID-19 times. Because it seems that there are some people in Barbados that no matter how the tide swings, this get through. I have concerns that there might be a feeling that because you can look easily and see where jobs may be on the horizon, that there will be a thinking among those kind of people that if you're desperate for work, you gotta take anything. Mr. President, like Senator Franklin, I hate that there are people that benefited from not paying VAT and other taxes. I hate that they got forgiveness. I hate that they didn't have to face the courts, Senator Franklin, but they got forgiveness. In the same way that I abhor that those people don't pay into the social security system, many of them, what is due, but they seemingly are allowed to benefit from goodwill, which is required more than ever in crisis situations. So, Mr. President, I understand and accept that it makes it very difficult for those of us who are being asked to share the burden to feel that we are doing more than sharing the burden, but that we are carrying single-handedly the burden. But, Mr. President, I recognize as well that if conditions aren't created to provide opportunity to have spending power, that we have ultimately no say or no possibility of pulling back a situation, even if that situation smells fishy. It may therefore require Hawkeyes to ensure that the human suffering for Barbadians is not more than it needs to be. So, the BOSS program. My interest as a representative in labor was to ensure, well, first of all, before I go there, BOSS was for savings. So I hear. Why so I hear? Because it was never presented to the labor movement as for savings. I am one of those labor leaders that don't believe that everything I hear I should accept as true. And forgive me if there are some who would believe that that is a lack of militancy or that is a lack of understanding. But it's hold my lane. I know that when the time is ripe for consultation, you got to come my way. The Barbados Workers Union, of which I am a proud leader, is an organization of 79 years old, almost. Looking forward to our 80th year in existence next year. And through all of that history, that organization has never been excluded from consultations. So there was a lot being put out there. Perhaps the Honorable Prime Minister said that when even before consulting labor, the idea of a forced savings was put out to the public. But it was put out to the public. It wasn't put out in proper consultations to labor. So at the time then, on May 25th, when a proposal was first formally put to labor, a proposal was put of what then also went out to the public the day prior. in an address under the banner of second anniversary celebrations, again to the public. Whoever members of the public chose to follow those celebrations. So it went out then as a meet and turn. And that is what was properly presented to Labour on the 25th of May, a national meet and turn. I've been part of meet and turns, and a meet and turn says to me that I opt from the start. I choose from the start. Nobody has to convince me. Nobody has to force me. I know that I want X amount of money by X date, and a little potluck, a meeting stirring. I could put in X amount, and I can take back out that same amount. No discounts, no interest, by a specified date. So a meet and turn concept was presented on the 25th of May that still mirrored a forced element to it. So the position was, if it is that a principle can be accepted, then let's move past the acceptance of that and see how we can make it palatable. If it is, and my financial controller has tried unsuccessfully on a number of occasions to explain to me the benefits of moving something from one line to another. She has convinced me that it makes sense. I didn't do so well in accounts and finance and those things. I do good in maths, but that ain't got nothing to do with accounts and finance. So based on whatever we were advised can be acceptable as an accounting principle, and we accept that, how then are we going to make it palatable in a way that the person who cannot afford to save would not feel that he, being a public sector worker, or she, being a public sector worker who cannot afford to save, is compromised? And I know many of them. I know many people who live literally from month to month, and who work to pay bills and the court and whoever else that they owe, and the courts too. But there are people who would want to be able to save, but they can't. The other issue that had to be addressed is the fact that basic economics, which is the only kind I know, indicates that in times of crisis, one of the things that you need is spending power. You need people to be able to spend to keep the economy moving. And if a person who can barely make it is asked to save what they should be spending, I don't think, from my layman's position, that sits well with the principle of generating spending, or doing enough to stimulate spending so that in turn the wheels in the economy can keep moving. So how do we address that issue from where you are, where a national meet and turn still looks forced? How do we get to some form of option? So our arguments were that while savings were desirable, it should not be forced to the detriment of an individual's personal arrangements. These arguments were received. So that the iteration of the proposal, if we be, that went from forced savings to a meet and turn to a boss move, even if it is a boss move by a boss crook, or by whatever else may be attributed to it. The movement suggests or was intended to convey an acceptance of a principle that was put very forcefully by labor, that a person should not ask to give from where they do not have the capacity to give. So it matters not if a person wants to do something. I want to go to heaven, but the only way I can get there is if I serve God. I might not die. I might be caught up. So I think that generally, I can speak for many in the labor movement who went through the discussions, who are now satisfied that the proposal which is before this honorable chamber is one that is an option from the start. And anybody who tries to convey that is not doing the discussions and where we are any justice. It's a commitment to a methodology that individuals don't have a choice over. But built into that methodology that is to achieve a certain accounting outcome is an element of option that recognizes if that person who wants to save cannot save because of their financial position, that they should not feel disadvantaged, neither should they actually be disadvantaged. So workers now have the option to cash their bonds in or to keep their bonds if they believe that they can save. And where did the central bank come into that? When the proposal was presented on the 25th of May, Labor heard a number of things that said these bonds can be traded, and if you can't afford it, you could go to your friend, you could go to a family member, you could go to your neighbor, you could go to a credit union, you could go to different people to trade these. And because we are not, well, certainly I'm not, trained in financial matters, I've said it before, so I don't think that I need to convince you by saying it no more. But it is about simplicity. Because if it seems complicated to me, if I have to explain it to another person, I can't. Because I'm already confused. And if I might have a better understanding than a person out there who I have to convince, then you understand me in problems if I can't understand it myself. So simplicity. How do we protect those that we represent? Where is the security? How can we agree that a person will have to go about looking for the people that they think got money who might not have money to purchase these things from them just to get what should be their salary? Their net income. So then it was labor. It was labor who suggested that the only credible institution that we could think about to provide that level of security would be the central bank. So that if a person says, I really can't, the main inconvenience that person would have to endure is getting their money from two sources instead of one, the central bank and central government. If y'all can fix that, fix it, and we can move on. And that was accepted. And the proposal brought back to us. Now, there are a number of questions. What would happen in the secondary market? Those were not questions, Mr. President, for my preoccupation. Those will be questions not for vulnerable public sector workers who don't have money. Those will be questions for the people in the public sector who may have money, who may want to do more. And I would say to them, if you come to me, I can direct you to a few people who understand these things, who may be able to explain to you. But my foremost concern is for the people who are vulnerable, who may want to, because they're faithful party members, who may want to, because they got a sense of pride in industry, but who can't. Those were the people that we sought to protect. Those were the people that we sought to protect. Public sector workers, not only in Barbados, but in other jurisdictions, are the easiest to pick on when you're in any kind of times. Furthermore, when you're in times that perhaps may be justified more easily. So the concerns then were, no job loss has to be a guarantee. No job loss has been the guarantee. Of course, there is a qualifier unless restructuring for efficiency has to be considered. And where there is restructuring for efficiency, that also has to be negotiated. The other concern was that a person who cannot afford to save can have access to their money. That has been answered for us because the access for the money comes not through one source, it comes through two sources. For better or for worse, I represent workers in both the public sector and the private sector. And I think I speak for all the workers in the private sector who have had to face lowered income and no income. I think I speak for them when I say that if theirs was merely a consideration of getting my money anyhow from more than one source, that would be a huge burden lifted. Our concern was that there should be no loss of cash in hand unless a worker opts to keep their bonds for an 18-month period. That concern has been answered. Public servants, we said, should get the first right to refusal. That concern was not answered. Because although theoretically that was our proposal and what we would want, it is not what is here in the bill before us. And there may be reasons for that. And some of the reasons that I've heard is that on the secondary market, where you want to be able to sell off the bonds as quickly as possible, you may not have the luxury of securing them for public sector workers. So, first come, first serve. There was, from the time this proposal then started getting wider public attention, there was a concern by some, or an interest by some who were pensioners. If we want a piece of the cake, or those who are about to become pensioners, if we want some of our gratuity in this thing, how can we access? And there's no provision that those determinations can be made, even if only on the secondary market. There's a concern I'm hearing about why 4 years. Simple Simon is me. I'm saying in the document that they can be redeemed in 2 years as well. Spending for people who are jobless, that's a commitment. That should be all of our commitments, because whether or not we address it this way, it has to be addressed. And when the government addresses it, NIS more than likely becomes involved, is triggered. And for those of us, at least those among us, who pay into Social Security in the first place, it means that we are paying. So as a representative body, my organization, as a leader in labor market services in Barbados, is happy that even if a solution is not a perfect one, that we've had the opportunity to influence the discussion in a direction that minimizes the injury or the perception of injury to a vulnerable public sector worker. We're happy, satisfied that we've been able to address a broad range of interests. Had we, as a true representative of the masses, opted to remain outside of the discussions, then what we would be discussing more than likely would be something that we could not accept for anybody at any level. We were able to influence. I recall labor taken to the streets in 2017 under a lot of criticism back then. But everything you do is subject to criticism, and long may it be that way. Because if one is not challenged through criticism, it probably signals that you're not doing things as well as you ought to be. And it probably gives way to complacency that labor certainly cannot afford. But one of the cries back then in 2017 was for the opportunity to be heard and to be able to advance a case on behalf of those whom we represent. That opportunity has been provided, perhaps not in a perfect world, but my philosophy as a union leader and on an individual level as well, is that if to a situation I cannot advance an alternative solution, I look to my partner, my best alternative. What can I do with what is presented to me? And how can I make the best of it? So the BOSS acronym also came from labor. The deliberations, the consultations, in our view, helped us to address the objectives that we defined at the start of the process. And now public sector workers have an opportunity. We always recognize that the decision would be a very individual decision. So I can do a Zoom meeting. I can do the typical kind of meeting with my members that could say to anyone with certainty that my members, 90% of them or 50% of them have signed off on. But what, as a labor leader in Barbados, I believe that I've been able to do is to remove as many of the obstacles, and now it's left to individuals to determine for themselves how they will deal with the situation. And what I've committed further is that wherever individuals have questions, where they have concerns, where they need guidance, I might not be able to give it, but I will commit to providing it by people that should be able to give it, to point people in a direction so that you're not left alone out there to wonder if you should or if you shouldn't. Perhaps one of the positives that came out of this is that even the General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union might need to upskill in financial matters, so that in another year or so, on any matter of a financial nature coming to this chamber, the General Secretary wouldn't be admitting to being a layman, but would be a top boss any matter. So, Mr. President, I want to say to workers, I want to say to public sector workers, first of all, there's no trickery in this that your representation has been party to. We recognize, and we've been hearing it the world over, that we are in unprecedented times, uncharted waters. Demands some creativity, demands doing things a little differently. And I think that I speak for labor when I say that to the best of our understanding, to the best of our capacity, collective capacity to understand what has been presented, we have done what we think provides the best context for a person who is interested in seeing how they may share in the burden. We have allowed for an element of job protection. We have allowed for a person not to extend themselves beyond the point that they can. And we have recognized that we have brothers and sisters in the private sector who need help. And the obligation is now ours to further ensure that where this help is provided, that it's not provided in a way that demeans them. It's not provided in a way under a banner of capital works that would see workers prostrating themselves. I didn't say prostitute. Prostrating themselves at the feet of people who just feel that they're giving handouts. That further responsibility, Mr. President, is ours, and it is a challenge that we will take, and it's a commitment we make to the workers and the people of Barbados. Mr. President, I support the bill.
I recognize Senator Greenidge.
I won't worry to sit, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. Mr. President, let me begin, first of all, by saying that I want to pitch my contribution about the same level that Senator Grant pitched his contribution earlier in the day. Senator Grant began his contribution by asking, why are we here? In other words, what he was really asking, or what he was really saying, is that this BOSS program should be contextualized. It has to be contextualized. I want to begin, sir, by saying that if we had to take away all of that legal and all of that technical definition of what a bond really is, we could say that this type of bond is nothing more than a loan which public servants are making to government. That is what it is. And government, in turn, will repay the public servants at an interest. In other words, Mr. President, the public servants will get back more from government than they lend. Truth be told, sir, the average Barbadian does not seem to be too interested in bonds. But I do believe, sir, that the wide debate and the wide interest surrounding this issue of these particular bonds will be an eye-opener for Barbadians, and perhaps from now onwards you will see a lot more boost, a lot more upsurge, a lot more interest in bonds from now onwards. Mr. President, I also want to say that Barbadians must stop being scared to invest. Barbadians must stop being scared about making their money work for them. Some of us, I admit, sir, are not good savers. We're not good at saving. And something like this, these bonds, would help in that regard. Sir, this is an excellent avenue for public servants to make a few extra dollars on their investment. It is saving at will. And even more importantly too, sir, these particular bonds per se, the bonds per se, taken alone, can be used, sir, as security for the public servants themselves to borrow money. Can be used as a separate and an acceptable form of security. You've heard it time and time again from speakers in the other place yesterday, as well as already in the Senate today, that banks are giving you 0.05 and 0.1 and all types of non-figures as interest on your money. And on top of that, sir, the banks are also inflicting numerous charges on you. Today, sir, when you put money in the bank, you are losing money. When you put money and the charges come out, and if you keep looking at it, you're losing and you're losing and you're losing. The bank is only keeping that money for you until you are ready for it. That is all that is happening. The only service that they're providing for you these days is keeping your money for you until you are ready for it. So Barbadians have to realize, and I think they have come to realize, that to get 5% interest on their money is a far better investment. So, sir, it's not going to surprise me at all if these bonds are oversubscribed. Boss is being done for love of country. And, sir, as Senator Grant said, boss must be contextualized. Boss must be put in its proper context. We cannot talk about the BOSS program, sir, as though some of us want us to. We cannot talk about the BOSS program as though the Prime Minister woke up one morning and said, this is what it will be. And that's that. BOSS must be contextualized. Why did we have to resort to BOSS? That is the question. why did we have to resort to BOSS? And that is the most important question of the day. What caused it? What caused us to be where we are? Did the Prime Minister bring it on herself? Was it the result of her poor management? Was it because she's incompetent? Was it because she's lacking in skills and lacking in ability and lacking in knowledge? Could she have avoided it? What is the context of BOSS? What is the context of BOSS? Sir, in the month of February this year, we might not, that is we in Barbados, we might not have been sailing smoothly. But sir, we had no problem with the weather. We had no problem with the weather. Sir, the estimates were laid in the lower house. And I remember we came in here to debate them, and Senator Franklin said, look, these things mean nothing to us now. I can't even talk. Estimates laid, we had plans, sir, for every sector. Good plans. We had taken 2 full years, sir, to clean up the mess left by the last administration. And we were virtually ready, sir, for takeoff. But, sir, enter COVID. Enter COVID. You have to put BOSS in context. The former administration, sir, had no crisis of this magnitude. Nobody ever had. Senator Franklin is urging me to say that. Nobody ever had. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. In fact, compared to what we are having now, the last administration had no crisis at all. They had no crisis. And yet, they could not handle the economy. Crisis or no crisis. No hotels, sir, had to be closed. Commercial flights were coming in as usual every day. This country didn't have to be shut down, sir. And yet still, in spite of all that, sir, the cry of the then finance minister week after week after week was, you tell us what to do. If you know we are not managing, you tell us what to do. Let me tell you something, sir. Sir, if this virus had overrun the world in 2016 or 2017, this country would have been crippled by now. This country would have been crippled. In 2016, in 2017, sir, the economy was on its deathbed. We in Barbados, we were at rock bottom, sir. Foreign reserves, sir, were as shaky as they could be. Downgrades were the order of the day. BOSS must be contextualized, sir. Fortunately, sir, when COVID touched down, we were in a better place. We were in a better place. Thanks to the leadership, we were in a better place. We were on a much smoother road. We were being very well led and being very well advised. COVID must be contextualized. We've also been hearing another expression, that government needs now to provide its own fiscal space. Government indeed, sir, needs money from somewhere in its effort to jumpstart certain construction projects and in an effort to put Barbadians back to work. Look at a scenario, sir, where government could say, I want to borrow $350 million. And there's a Swiss bank that says, I will lend Barbados $350. I thought $1 million. But now, Barbados says, but when I repay, I won't be paying back $350 million. With the interest and so on, I'll be repaying $410 million. Or government could say, not so much. I want to borrow $150 million for this particular project. But when I repay, it looks as though I'll be paying back $185 million. But the point I'm making, sir, is that the interest on that goes into the hands of that particular foreign bank in any event. The aim of government is to provide work for Barbadians in the construction industry. You're saying that some of them could very well have been those who were working in the hotel industry and who are now without work. Senator Moore made the point that there are more people beside those in the hotel who are working in the hotels who may not be working. The point I'm making, sir, is that it is better for Barbadians to bear the cost of lending that money to government than government having to go to a bank or to a lending institution to borrow that money at a time like this. Government needs that money and needs it very badly. And it is better, Mr. President, to get it from its own public, especially, sir, if at the same time the public servants will benefit. It's much better that way, sir. Because the public servants will be buying into their future. So, Mr. President, this BOSS program is a win-win situation. It's a win for government. And it's a win for the public servants. If ever there was a win-win situation, Mr. President, this is it. And we have learned, we know this is the way it works, that a worker who does not want to participate in the BOSS program will not lose a red cent, won't lose anything. It is an optional plan. There is no intention by government, Mr. President, to permanently deprive any public servant of any part of that public servant salary. No intention of government at all. The worst which can be said about the program, and the worst which can be said about it, is that it is a deferred payment. That is the worst that can be said about it. Nothing more. We did not, Mr. President, try to push anything down the throats of public servants. We consulted with the labor movement. Personally, I haven't seen such wide consultation in a long while, sir. I think our leader, our prime minister, is something like a consulting machine. I know it's COVID. I know, yes, she has to go to the press and so on. But sometimes I wonder, even with her condition, the pace she goes at. The pace she goes at. There was consultation with the full social partnership, sir. There was no disrespect whatsoever to organized labor. No high-handed, unilateral decision-making. And boss today, sir, ends up being no threat whatsoever to the public servants of Barbados. Mr. President, if you take home every cent that you work for next month, there is no salary cut. No salary cut. So this exercise, sir, is not about trying to fool the civil servants. This is not an exercise, sir, about talk and syntax and rhetoric. This is, sir, not about trying to convince them that this is just another salary cut and that it will cause public servants to suffer. We have to realize that the public servants of Barbados are educated public servants, sir. And, sir, you can't fool educated public servants at all. They can read through you, too. As much as you want to read through them, they can read through you. Yes, Mr. President, I do agree that there is that particular public servant out there whose salary is barely sufficient to get him or her through the month. I know that. They have their mortgage. They have to think about groceries, about maybe sometimes even the car payment. They have to think about the light bill and the water bill. And as a result, sir, I consider it to be a good thing that the bonds are optional to accommodate such persons. But, sir, we remember too that there are those public servants who may have some elbow room and some disposable income. And for them, sir, I say again that this bond is a good investment. You pay no withholding tax on it. There are no bank charges. You get your 5% interest. It is a good investment. The BOSS program, Mr. President, is all part of our effort to crawl out of this COVID crisis. Put it in context, as Senator Grant said. We are trying to crawl out of this crisis. And I believe, Mr. President, that why some naysayers are so upset about what is going on is because we in Barbados are responding better to this plague than they anticipated that we would. If we had failed to handle this crisis well, some of them might have been smiling, because this is the nature of politics. This is the nature of politics. And I'm sure, so I've said it already in here, that even if our Prime Minister had given everybody in Barbados a villa, there are some of them who would accept that villa and still criticize her. And still criticize her, sir. They will find fault with whatever she does. Even when she is taking a decision for the love of country. I remember, sir, years ago, a cleric, every morning at about 6 o'clock, used to have a program called for love of country. And he, every morning, would take a very topical issue and he would discuss it. And then he would come down on the side, I say this, I do this for love of country. And I remember too, sir, when I did literature, a speech that Brutus made after Caesar was assassinated. And Brutus said, "Who is there so vile?" He thought he had done the right thing. And he thought there were those who would criticize him. And he said, "Who is there so vile that would not love his country? If any speak, for him have I offended." Who is there so vile that will not love this country? If any speak, for him have I offended. Those same words could easily have dropped from our Prime Minister's lips. Who is there so vile that will not love his country? If any speak. For him have I offended. Senator Franklin is being a little naughty. Sir, during these very testing times, we had few options. There wasn't much else that we could do. We had few options. Even our detractors were telling us what to do. One of the things they told us to do was this. They told us, swallow our pride. Undo what you did previously. Go to Parliament and legislate to cut public servant salaries. We didn't want to do that. The public servants didn't want us to do either. But that was one of the options. Things were that bad. And they were telling us that is what we should have done. They also said we could lay off between 1,500 and 2,000 public servants. We didn't want to do that. Nor the public servants didn't want us to do that either, sir. None of these options would have been acceptable to government or to the public servants. Mr. President, the last thing in the world this government wanted to do was to cut public servant salaries. The last thing in the world this government wanted to do is to lay off people. You see, sir, this is the same government that strongly opposed the 8% cut in the 1990s. This is the same government, sir. We know what we stand for. This is the same government that legislated that we would never again cut public servant salaries. And I can tell you something, sir. I was the Minister of the Labour at the time, and I led that debate in the House. We were never again going to cut public servant salaries. This is the same government, sir, that gave back the public servants of this country the very 8% which the other administration had taken away. We have not been unfair ever to the public servants of this country. We are not going to do anything to put them in jeopardy. Nothing. Why should the opposition, sir, why should the Democratic Labour Party, with all respect, now try to paint us as this spiteful and this non-caring government? Thank you, Mr. Senator Grant. Boss must be contextualized. It must be. We are doing what we are doing, Mr. President, because better cannot be done at this time. We would not have been doing this at all had COVID not shown up on our doorsteps. We would not have been doing it. So a very unwelcome visitor, very unwelcome visitor. A call has gone up from the opposition that we are doing it because the IMF tell us to do it. And so this type of opposition is nothing new. It is politics. I expect it. I remember, sir, look, one of the best pieces of social engineering, one of the best pieces of social legislation we have ever had in this country is the Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act. I have some relatives in St. Philip, sir, who they have beautiful homes built on lands that they acquired under the Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act. I mean, St. Philip has so many of it, had so many tenantries. And you know, when that particular debate came before the House, it was opposed by the other side. It was opposed by the other side. And the other side said, you know, that the people whose land you are acquiring under the Tenantries Purchase Act should put all of you in court. That was the attitude of the other side. So I don't mind, Mr. President, the opposition's position. I don't mind that at all. Barbadians can think for themselves, sir. They thought for themselves a few years ago, and I know that they can think through this and see how helpful boss can be to them. They are not going to be hoodwinked, the Barbadian people, by anyone. Sir, I think I've spoken enough. But one of the things that I would want to do, I have already said that we were very well advised. I know that Dr. Prasad, Dr. Masco, Mr. Strawn, Minister Cadler, and those who are always there to assist the Prime Minister have done an excellent job. But, sir, one thing I want to say. There's a gentleman called Kevin Greenwich that he's not, because don't forget the Greenwich part. No, I'm not interested at all. No interest at all. But he, one thing I liked about the way he sold this boss program is the way he was able to put it in layman's language. Sometimes when economists talk, they go way over my head, way over there. But when he talks, when he puts down a point, he puts it in layman's language that you can understand. You can understand it. And I think that he sold this to the public even more so than the Prime Minister did. He made her job a lot easier to do. And I want, on the floor of the Senate, sir, to commend that gentleman by the name of Kevin Greenwich, Dr. Kevin Greenwich, for having done a wonderful job. Mr. President, huh? He's not my son. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Senator Springer, now your time.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to add my voice in support of this bill. The Barbados optional saving scheme. Firstly, I want to, like my colleagues before me, commend the Prime Minister and her team for such a revolutionary piece of legislation that empowers public servants and give them the opportunity to invest in bonds, invest in Barbados, and at the same time, do that at a return of 5% on the investment. Now, this country, Mr. President, now finds itself at the crossroads. And if we are unable, as a people, to reimagine ourselves, if we are unable to, or if we don't play our cards right, Mr. President, then we may be facing perhaps the biggest economic calamity that this country and certainly this region has ever seen. Now, at this point, I want to also commend the government for engaging the social partnership in the way that it has in these trying times in order to get us out of this situation that we are in. And just to respond to what the good senator on the other side had said about not getting it right, I just want to make the point that this government never claimed to be perfect. It never claimed to be Jesus Christ. It never claimed to have all of the answers.
Amen. Never claimed to be fine.
And if we didn't get it right, the name, the concept in the beginning, the important thing is that we got it right at the end before we presented it to the people of Barbados.
Come on.
And that's the important fact.
Good point.
So I reject this notion by the other side that, you know, the consultative process that we would have taken to get us to this point was unnecessary. It was a waste of time. I know we can't do anything right for him. If we take our time and we do things, we are dilatory. If we do things efficiently and quickly, it's a rush job. We're not perfect like those on that side. And I understand that.
Thank you.
But at the same time, I must admit that I am happy with what this government has been able to do thus far, the measures that have been put in place thus far. First, the BERT program, and secondly, the BOSS program now that we are debating, that will stabilize this country, Mr. President. Now, you also know that were this previous administration or even future administration, that they would like to believe that they will probably become at some point, that, and they were creative enough to come up with a initiative like this. It wouldn't have the flexibility that this one has, and public servants would not be able to enjoy the benefits that they will soon enjoy as a direct result of this particular initiative. I believe it was last year, Mr. President, I stood in this honorable chamber, maybe not this physical place, but in the Senate, and I spoke to those, what I refer to then as fiscal patriots, those persons who would have made a sacrifice for this country. Because back then I saw what persons were doing during that restructuring process was a sacrifice. But this, Mr. President, could be seen as more of an investment in self, an investment in the future of this country, an investment in persons' own financial security. Now, I've heard persons talk about pay cut, pay jump, pay wound, all kinds of terms to refer to this particular initiative, and to give the impression that this government is imposing something on the good people of Barbados, on the public workers of Barbados, public servants. And I will deal with this whole idea of this being an imposed or a force initiative. Because as the name implies, this program is optional. And that must be emphasized. It's optional. But this debate, Mr. President, this afternoon is really about savings. And when we talk about savings, I can speak to my challenges that I've had with the banks in this country. I've been in here, I lamented in here that I tried to open a bank in this country last year. And first it took me 3, almost 4 months before they could even get back to me, claiming I was a PP, and that made it difficult for them to even consider me as a client. They didn't even want my money. Yeah, politically exposed, yeah. For some reason, they didn't want me to open an account at their branch. And I came in here, I talked about it. And very quickly afterwards, I got a call, and I got through. But that is peculiar to us, all of us in here, and our relatives and persons in the other place. But what I can speak to that is even more unfortunate about the banks, and I'm sure that many persons in Barbados can relate to this, are those bank charges, those fees that we have to pay every month. I challenge anybody to leave a few $100s on the bank and go back 18 months later and see what they see. I could guarantee you that you may find yourself owing the bank money in 18 months, far less having money on the bank. And for some persons, this is unfair. And the good Senator Greenidge, Vice President, he alluded to it, that sometimes you put your money on the bank and you end up, you lose money by putting money on the bank. In other words, you lose your money by putting the money on the bank. And in America, North America, they refer to that as nickel and diming you. You can be nickel and dime into bankruptcy if you keep your money on a bank these days. And it's getting worse and worse every day. But what the BOSS program does, Mr. President, is that it offers Barbadians the opportunity, public workers of all walks of life, the opportunity to experience that euphoria that you get when you see a little bit of returns on your investment. Many years ago, I used to work in NTW, Mr. President. It was my second or third job. I was young. I was not very familiar with the banking system at the time. I wasn't familiar with the credit union. I didn't have much money to talk about. But what I remember from those days, what I remember as a young person working out there on the road was then the credit unions, they had to have been, were paying dividends. It was perhaps the most exciting period in those days for those public workers. Very exciting. People were excited. People would leave work early, and they would talk about they're going to get the dividends, because that was a little returns on their money, and it was even something more exciting than payday, because on payday you knew what you were getting, and it wasn't much. But with the dividends, it offered a kind of that element of surprise. It was like opening a Christmas gift. So it was a very exciting feeling when persons receive the dividends. So it tells me that Barbadians, they know about investing, and they like the feeling that they get when they see returns on their investment. Now, over the years, I've seen that, that excitement wane, and I'm told that dividends are still being paid. Of course, they're still being paid, but I'm not sure if there anything to be excited about, given the types of interest rates that we are now seeing in the banking systems and the credit unions and so on and so forth. But Mr. President, the BOSS program, it more or less gives you that opportunity in a few years, but to be excited again, because you're for the first time having or you're seeing real returns, real tangible returns on your investment when you save. It gives us the opportunity to earn something again. And all my life growing up, I have heard that when you put your money on the bank, that you will earn interest. The bank invests your money or something like that, and you earn interest on that investment. But I can tell you there are a lot of people out here, a lot of working class people, who have never experienced interest. They've never seen it. But how can you experience it? When you walk into the bank to the teller, they charge you $5. You go and use the ATM card at some other machine, $5 they charge you. You go to, if you're withdrawing money, if you go to check the balance, they charge you $150. And these are real things, God experience these things. So even if you were to get some interest, that money is being eaten away by the banks. You will never see that interest. Now, if you step foot in the bank. Now, if you use an ATM because it was convenient to use the one closer to you and not drive all the way in town to use the one that you got your card from. So there are a number of measures in place to ensure that you would not necessarily see a lot of returns on your investment if you were to place it in the bank. But here it is. We have the BOSS program coming along and offering you 5% on your investment. Real percentage, real money in dollars and not necessarily cents or negatives, as is the case right now. And Mr. President, at some point, I heard it in here earlier today, the term forced savings was being bandied about, forced savings. And I would not lie to this honorable chamber, when I first heard that term, it warmed my heart. It's true. I was not offended by the term for savings, because there are many among us who would love to save. They would love to save, Mr. President, but they can't. And it's not because they don't have the disposable income. And it's not because they don't work for a decent salary. It's not because they have financial commitments, like a mortgage, a car payment, car loan, something like that. It's not because of that, Mr. President, that they can't save. It's because they lack the discipline to save. They lack the discipline. They just can't bring themselves to put down money on the bank. There are a lot of people out there like that. People who work for good money who are like that. And there are a lot of people like that in the public service. And the good senator on the other side alluded to that earlier. He said it in a way that I wouldn't say it, but he might have been partly right in his assessment that a lot of public workers don't save. All right? And it's a fact. A lot of people don't save as much money as they should. All right? Lack the discipline. And there's nothing to be ashamed about, Mr. President. It's a fact of life. Nothing to be ashamed about. That you don't save a lot. All over the place, people don't save. And why? Because they have a lot of friends. They go out a lot. They enjoy the money. They like to travel. They like to do all those things that, that you have money you don't want. It's difficult to deprive yourself of things that you enjoy if you have money to hand. It's true. But what COVID-19 has taught us is that we don't need many of those little luxuries. We don't need to travel as much. What we need to do is to save something for a rainy day. That is what COVID has taught us, that we need to save something for a rainy day. And many of us did not take that advice before. And many a mother, many a father have gone to bed over the past couple of weeks and months wishing that they had taken that advice, because they've been experiencing a lot of rainy days as a direct result of this COVID pandemic. And they wish that they had someone had forced them to save, or incentivized them, let me just use that word, to save their money before, maybe 18 months ago. They would have had something to fall back on during these last couple months where they experienced this unprecedented hardship. So I say that to make the point that perhaps the concept of being forced to save is not as evil a concept as some people make it sound. In fact, it could be a good thing. We're being forced now to eat more healthy. Some of us eating a lot more healthy foods now, and that's a good thing because it's good for our health. You know, a lot of the things that we would have enjoyed, we may not be able to get in the near future. So we're looking now at growing our own foods and eating some of the things that we produce, and that is a good thing. And I mean, that would not have been the case had things continue as they did before. But beyond all of that, Mr. President, I believe that apart from the fact that persons are now finding themselves in a position that they are unable to help themselves or to look after themselves, I think that public servants also see this as an opportunity now to help their country and to help their brother man. And that's why I believe that, just like the Senator Greenidge had alluded to, this particular program could have easily been named the Barbados Win-Win Savings Scheme. It would not have had the same type of ring to it as the BOSS scheme, because believe me, I don't know, you said that you were responsible for that. That's a BOSS name, a BOSS term. But it would have been basically the same thing, because it's basically a win-win savings scheme. And other people will look on. Those within the private sector, I'm sure that going forward, persons will look. That's why I know that this thing will be oversubscribed. And other people, I talked to a lawyer yesterday in Marseille. She told me, boy, when I get a chance, I want to opt in. I'm going to snatch at some of those bonds, because people now see more so than ever before the importance of saving. And if they can't do it of their own volition, then they'll be happy that somebody will force them, encourage them, let me put it like that, incentivize them to save, because they see the benefits of saving. We were able to rally on, living paycheck to paycheck, living hand to mouth, and never having to face something like this. So it was okay. But now we realize it's not okay. You got to listen to your grandparents. Save, put down something for a rainy day. But as I said, this is a win-win situation, because it gives those public servants the opportunity to save in the event that something happens, God forbid, in the next 3 to 4 years. And it also gives the government that fiscal wiggle room, you know, to carry out undertake some of these capital projects. And I'm happy to see that some of the projects that they have earmarked would involve the refurbishing of the schools, because I work within the schools, and I know that some of those schools are in a state of disrepair. I mean, we would have been ambitious last year in trying to fix about 43 schools or so, but there's still another 30 or so, 30 plus, even more than that, schools that are still in a dire state of disrepair, even as we speak. There's still a lot of schools that need refurbishing. So I'm glad to see that monies here will be transferred and diverted to attend to things like that. And yes, the pothole situation is not as bad, but If some of the money goes into fixing the few that are remaining, then I would support that too. But most importantly, I understand that some of that money will be used for revamping the water system. And rural places like Wood Hill, that haven't had water since last month, and Hillaby, that haven't had water since Friday, could possibly get some running water in the pipes. It's a reality, not only on rural parts of Barbados. All of it in St. Joseph and St. John, and parts of St. Thomas. I would be happy to see that some energy goes into revamping the water system, as I saw there in the document, and ensuring that these persons could enjoy that basic essential service. So I'm happy with this bill in that regard. That monies will be diverted towards that. And another thing too, they mentioned the bushing. I pass the road, see a lot of young fellas that would otherwise be on the block sitting down are engaging in honest work. That's not to say that they weren't engaging in honest employment before, but they engage in honest work, the bushing and cleaning up all the storm drains and cutting all the bush. Some in Belton, some from Orange Hill. I see them all over Barbados. See them down Spring Garden when they come across on the mornings. I see them in Redmond Village. But the fact of the matter is that I see a lot of young people working. All coming up there, Halls Road, or whatever you call it there, but community college, I see them. A lot of people are working, and more people will work because you're going to need people to the bush. So this provides opportunity for persons to be gainfully employed. And at the same time, people to create other forms of employment and drive the economy forward. And that's what we all want to see, Mr. President. I'm sure even those persons, have not heard anybody really criticize the bill. And that's good. People have had the opportunity to speak of areas where they would want to see improvements, and that's okay because we're always looking to improve. Persons speak to their involvement and to assure the base that everything was done in their benefit, and I support them in that as well. But there's no criticism of this bill because there's nothing really to criticize. There's nothing about this bill that you can't appreciate. It's not a pay cut. So even if to some people's mind it smells like one, the fact of the matter is it is not. It is optional. And optional being the operative word. And there are people who are in that would remain in, and some will opt out. And there are some who are out that would love to opt in. I know that there's nobody in Barbados that would opt in to a pay cut. Nobody. If you had a choice, Mr. President, to get your money cut or to keep your money to spend, to have in your pocket, you would choose to get your money. And that's the reality. So the mere fact that we anticipate that these bonds will be oversubscribed and that there will be a rush for persons to stash up these bonds tells me that it can't possibly be a pay cut, Mr. President. I'm gonna close right now. This is an investment. We have invested in this party. The people of Barbados have invested in this Barbados Labour Party, in this government. And within 18 months, we have seen returns on our investment. And now, even 6 months beyond that, we can see that it was a good investment. Investing in the Barbados Labour Party was a good investment. Because just like Senator Greenwich alluded to, had we not done so, this country, this economy would have collapsed long time. No way it would have survived this pandemic in the way that it seems to have survived and pushing forward. And basically what's happening is another investment, another 18 months, and then another few months to that investment see its full maturity. We will enjoy the fruits of this investment in the same way that we are enjoying the fruits of the investment in the Barbados Labour Party today. And that persons feel safe with a sense of confidence in that we will get through this thing together. And we know, and this has shown us that we know that if it were the other people, we would have been sunk. We would have been in a sunken place had it been the other people. So I just want to encourage all those public workers out there hearing my voice to invest in yourself and invest in your country. I want to thank those persons who were involved in the process from the get, who would have been part of this very imaginative scheme that would see people of Barbados, public workers in Barbados, benefit as well as the government. I want to again commend the Prime Minister and her team for a fantastic job, because in truth and in fact, at the end of the day, we as a people, we are all we have. And with those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator. I now call on Senator Rawdon Adams.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to pick up on some of the context that Senator Grant and Senator Greenidge set out. For that's the key here. What is it we're trying to do, and why are we here? I'll fill in a couple of gaps I felt that perhaps this skirted over. You know, last week in here we debated the catastrophe fund bill, and we said then that what we were looking to try and do with the $51.4 million that was in there was provide some specific relief to businesses who are having liquidity problems. This might be in the form of cash flow support or anything else that we deem absolutely necessary to prevent a large swathe of our small and medium-sized enterprises going to the wall and perhaps realizing bankruptcy. One of the large reasons we want to do that is to preserve jobs. It is far easier to preserve those businesses and those jobs than to allow them to go to the wall and then hope that they come back. It's the difference between turning on a light switch, electricity, and rubbing two twigs together and hoping to generate fire. Has to be done. We also said at that time that one of the driving forces that was pushing us to do that was the fact that our tax take is forecast to drop. At that time last week we were saying about $450 million, and I think that has risen now. We're talking closer to $500 million. That was one pressure. And on the other side, we had 45,000 odd claims on the unemployment fund. You had twin pressures on us that had to be mitigated somehow. So this was one form of doing it, especially on the what's called the operating expenditure side of things, not investment, things that you have to spend in order to keep going. But the point was made that this week we would be talking about the BOSS program. Now, the BOSS is something different. It addresses capital expenditure projects. Now, these are very, very important for a couple of reasons. First of all, that is a form of investment. That drives growth. It creates jobs. It increases the capital stock of a country such that it can continue to move forward. You cannot just spend operating expenditure. You have to invest. Now, the way it is being done is really what we've talked about a great deal today. I think it's quite innovative. It gives Barbadians, notably in the public sector, a chance to invest, to bet on themselves. This is key. We're putting our money where our mouths are. Now, why is that important? Again, last week, I made the point that there's about $3 billion worth of private sector capital projects in the pipeline. And for the most part, those have slowed right down in terms of execution. And a lot of that is due to the psychological impact of COVID. Most people have adopted a wait-and-see attitude. Now, you can see this amongst individuals. It's very clear to most people that they are not lashing out on a new flat-screen television. They are hunkering down. They're husbanding what they've got to make sure that they can survive whatever is coming their way. And businesses are doing the same thing. Whether those financiers are domestic or foreign, they also have a wait-and-see attitude. Now, for us, the longer that continues, the closer we will be to disaster. We have to break that cycle. You know, it's said that if you learn finance or economics, you know, you often hear this joke that a banker is a guy who gives you an umbrella when the sun is shining and takes it away when the rain falls. And that's quite true, but you try and look at it from their point of view. They are now considering their prior calculations. They're wondering, am I still going to get the future cash flows that I calculated initially? Now, in my experience, you can spend a great deal of time guessing at what changes might come, changing your strategy, but in the end, you're just guessing at change. It's far better to look at those things that are going to remain the same. What is not going to change for us and for our investors? Well, there are a number of them. All of them are related to our largest industry, tourism. And I'd start just with the political stability that we enjoy in this country. We take that for granted, but we have a system where we will allow any representative in the upper or lower house to come in and make a contribution. It might be wild or sensible, fact-based or anecdotal, philosophically consistent, as Senator Franklin said this morning, or politically convenient. It can meander, it can be direct, and it could be filled with ritual abuse, or it could actually be relevant. And I'd argue we've actually heard the full range of those things today, sometimes in a single speech, but certainly in the collection that we've heard overall. Now, having said all of that, there's a strength in having a system that allows us to do that. Everybody gets heard. I was particularly struck by Senator Moore's speech. I thought that this was the perfect example of the strength of our system. I liked how she described the evolution of this legislation, how it started, how there were objections, how we sat down, we talked about it, and we came to a consensus of what was a sensible way forward. That approach that we have, that's not going to change. That's a strength. I'll just mention one thing that I objected to in her speech, and it's when she touched on burden sharing. I think the fact that we have people who are not in the public sector, 45,000, making these claims on the NIS system is proof that burden sharing is being realized across society, and it would be wrong to imply that it's all falling on a single sector. But having said that, the worth of what she said is key. That strength that we have, that's not going to change. And I'd ask our investors to look closely at that instead of guessing at other changes. We're going to remain a politically stable and vibrant democracy. Similarly, our beaches are not going to change as far as tourists are concerned. The beauty of the seaside, that's not going to change. Any person who knows what a cold winter is like is going to hanker after what we have in this country. And they're also going to like what we've done in our approach to COVID-19. You know, we've put in infrastructure to cope with what might happen, and we've clearly contained the threat that we had at the beginning of COVID-19. Now, when we talk about the BOSS program in that context, sometimes you have to demonstrate to people that despite the things you have that are not going to change, that they should continue to see as a huge strength, you have to put your money where your mouth is. By taking the 110 or 154 million, depending whose calculation you want to use, and putting it towards capital projects, you're showing not only individuals that it's business as usual, you're nudging these private sector investors to come forward. Nobody likes to be left out. Nobody likes to think that maybe someone else is making money where I should make money. When the government starts to put money towards infrastructure, it's clearly nudging these private investors to get going also. This is a contextual element that's very, very important, I think, to realize. We have to get that investment flowing. And that, to me, is one of the key elements of the BOSS program. That it can be done with the patriotic support of those who take it up is key, but let's not forget what we're actually trying to do here. Now I'm going to take a brief excursion into something that was raised by Senator Franklin earlier. He talked about the Protection of Wages Act. Yep. And he hit on there are two elements there. He hit on something that struck me. When we first started talking about the BOSS program, there's some hysteria that it was illegal, and so on and so forth. And it's nice to hear that has gone away. But I would say this about that Protection of Wages Act, that as Senator Franklin emphasized, that was brought in to stop employers from paying workers in anything other than cash. Couldn't pay somebody in black belly sheep or rum or pile of yams or anything like that. You had to pay them in cash. Now, I don't think there's any question that that is something that isn't respected nowadays. I can't think of any case I've heard of where a worker has brought a case against an employer that he's not being paid in cash. So that's key. That's almost as given. As an aside, I will say that having several times declared that he's not an economist or a financial person, I just set him straight on one thing. Legal tender is not the same thing as money. Legal tender falls within the definition of money. Money can be a variety of things. A means of payment, a medium of exchange, a store of value, all those things can be money. Legal tender is very tightly defined, and it's defined in Barbados under the Central Bank of Barbados Act. Legal tender is notes and coins. That's what it is. And ideally that's used as a means of payment. But you shouldn't consider it money in the legal sense. Now, having said that, I actually think what you said is more sensible. And that's reflected in some of the amendments to that Protection of Wages Act. I think the last time it was touched is 1975, and it recognized that, implicitly, it recognized that cash was not the only way to pay somebody. You could pay them by check, for example. But check is not legal tender. Check is simply a recognition of legal tender. That's all. But that act doesn't touch, for example, electronic transfers. You can now pay by smartphone, by bank direct debit, and so on. That's technically that's excluded, and you could say that anybody paid that way perhaps is being paid illegally, which would make which would be a ridiculous way to interpret the law. But anyway, come back on track now. The other point of that legislation is, having set out this principle that you can't abuse people in the way you pay them, it actually sets out something far more flexible and pragmatic underneath that. And a lot of this is rooted in convenience. So, for example, if there's a section on assignment of wages, if you owe child support or anything else the court has assigned. And I think in Section 19, they touch directly on payroll deductions that would go towards savings plans. And those might be, they call it provident funds or pension funds, or, and this is important, any other scheme. Now, the BOSS is such a program, and it fits very neatly into that piece of legislation. Now, there are a number of other things that I had to make notes on that were covered in here, in part by Senator Franklin, mostly, in fact, by Senator Franklin. Some of them, I think, come from the other place, with the opposition leader there, and it wouldn't be right to let them pass without some comment. So the very first of these, and I hope I'm quoting directly, Senator Franklin said earlier, this BOSS program is a clever way of printing money. I'm glad you prefaced your remarks by saying you weren't an economist or a financial analyst. This is very far from anything related to printing money. There's no money added to the aggregate supply in the economy. There's no money that's been produced out of thin air. This BOSS program is relying, amongst other things, on one simple financial idea, and that is this, that money flows where it's going to realize the greatest return. Now, by setting up this program, first of all, you're offering, as several senators have said, you're offering public servants the chance to get out of a 0% interest rate environment, or very close to it, a fee-heavy system, and you're letting them get a return without holding tax of 5%. And it would surprise me no end if this offer is not taken up, simply based on that financial idea that money will go where it can realize the greatest return. Now, against that, the government also, for its part, will take that money and put it where it feels it can realize the greatest return in terms of investing in capital expenditure projects. We've reallocated cash from one place and deployed it more efficiently somewhere else. That's the theory, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be confirmed in practice. Now, in the other place, there were a couple of things that were said. I have to say one of them confused me, because I really don't see the point of it. But the opposition leader said at one point that these bonds shouldn't be considered an investment for them being public servants, but a loan to the government of Barbados. Well, they're one and the same thing for a financial person. You know, my investment is your loan. It's very, very simple, and that's the way it should be looked at. He also said something else. I think it's a legitimate question. He said, why should we divert expenditure from wages towards capital expenditure, especially on tourism, given the outlook for tourism? Well, I refer him and anyone else asking that question back to my opening statement about changes. Some things are not going to change in this country, and that industry is going to come back. It's only a matter of time. Now, you can continue to spend money on wages. In fact, we're spending the same amount of money on wages. We're merely reallocating money to capital expenditure. But if you want to overcome this hesitancy that we see both amongst lenders and individuals, you're going to have to kick off capital expenditure projects. It's not much more complicated than that. Again, it would be remiss of me not to. There are certain themes that Senator Franklin in particular returns to again and again in here, and VAT, I think, is one. I just make one comment on that. I think the government has to do all it can to recover lost debts. I feel that it did. But on the PDDP or PDP side, it's one thing to say that in here when you have an economic spokesman who's himself saying he would do away with VAT altogether, he wouldn't bother collecting anything, and he put in a new system of taxation. And I'd link that to the idea of being philosophically consistent, by the way. I'm assuming that he hasn't changed his view since he said that. But you can't say that in one place and then come and try and lambaste people for not collecting the VAT and implementing and improving the system as far as they can. That just makes no sense. Well, he sits with you, I'm assuming that you collaborate on the contributions, but I hope so. And the final piece was, again, it's a recurring theme, this idea that there are too many ministers. So ministers have to prove their worth. I think that's the first thing everybody would accept. But against that, it's interesting to hear that, but just last week, I think we had Mr. Springer on your behalf saying he wanted to create another one. He wants to separate culture from sport and actually multiply the number of ministries that are out there. So again, I think there's some inconsistency, and it would be wrong to let those things actually pass. But in concluding, I think the absolute key point of this piece of legislation is that we have to kickstart investment overall. This is an innovative way to do it. It's a smart way to do it, and I commend it to the Chamber. I'm obliged, sir.
I recognize Senator Drake.
Thank you, Mr. President. This afternoon, coming on now to evening, Pardon? Mr. President, we've heard a lot today, and I will assure my colleague on the other side that I'm not aiming to be perfect. I agree with him on that. And I know that Senator Adams said he's heard a lot of things, but I hope that this contribution would at least be meaningful to the chamber. Mr. President, the Barbados Optional Savings Scheme Bill 2020. So much has been said. Sir, we've heard context is necessary, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I was recently listening to a seminar, more or less, and he was a pastor, and he described the situation as what is happening now as wet wood is burning. That is how he described the world in which we're living in at the moment. Wet wood is burning. And I thought it very interesting, because what he's saying is the situation is so bad that you can light wood that is wet. So how then wood that is dry, how will dry wood fare? And so given the characteristics of the Barbadian economy, it can be considered dry wood. And that is where I would start the conversation. Sir, government is bringing this bill because they find themselves in a dilemma, like all governments across the world. And that is no secret. Sir, the IMF has reported figures of estimates of how much the economy will contract between 7 and 12%. So, and I don't even know if that upward forecast includes a second wave at the end of the year. But nonetheless, at the moment, it is expected to contract between 7 and 12%. And for all intents and purposes, we are hearing that this is the worst economic shock in modern history that this economy will experience. So what do we do? What do we do? Sir, the bill, the BOSS Bill 2020, is seeking to reduce government's expenditure by paying persons less in the short run if they opt in, because revenues have fallen by, we're now hearing that estimate of about $500 million. But yet government is still very much committed to running a 1% primary surplus under the IMF program. And some people will have their varying views on that, but that is what government has committed to. Sir, the bill is before us as well because constitutionally and by law, we cannot do this without consent. Government workers have to agree to this change in their pay. So, sir, what is it that we're talking about here? And I go back to context. The World Bank put out a report earlier this month entitled Pandemic Recession, the Global Economy in Crisis. And it states, Mr. President, that COVID-19 recession will involve a decline in global gross domestic product per capita by 6.2%, making it the deepest global recession since 1945 to 1946, and more than twice as deep as the recession associated with the global financial crisis in 2008. So, sir, if that is the circumstances that we're faced with, we've had other global recessions in the past. How have we fared? I checked. Sir, the global recession of 1971, the Barbados economy contracted by 2%. In 1982, our GDP contracted by 5%. In 1991, 4%. And in 2009, because of that financial crisis, we contracted by 5%. And we know that since 2009, 8 years we recorded economic contractions. And we can contribute that to poor domestic economic policy and all other things included. But, sir, the words in the report that are of concern to me is that this crisis will be more than twice as deep as 2008-2009 global recession. And hence why government is trying to put policies in place, not to grow the economy, Mr. President. Because in this global climate, I would like to see any economy that would grow by the end of this year. Sir, government right now is trying to ride out a storm. That is what we're doing, Mr. President. But what I find even more interesting is that with every recession, there is always a debate in Barbados about what we should do with public sector wages. Even in a time of plenty, when things are good, it is acknowledged by and large that there is an excess of labor in the public sector, or a misalignment, because we have some departments that have too many people and some that don't have enough workers to carry the workload. So here we find ourselves again, sir, in 2020, having the same debate again. How do we keep the public sector at least afloat to maintain and retain jobs? But, sir, I see two scenarios playing out in this discussion. Two. And the first one is what the bill addresses. Government is saying, in order to meet our fiscal targets, we need some workers in the public sector, and we need a secondary market to buy bonds to the tune of $153 million over an 18-month period. And what we want to do with that money, Mr. President, is we want to put it into capital works projects. Because, as we've heard on the other side, for all intents and purposes, capital works creates jobs, it spurs investment, and it gets economic activity going. And so I make no arguments about that. That is true. But, sir, there is a caveat there that I have not heard today, putting two things together. That economic policy has worked in the past when people were coming to Barbados. Hotel rooms were filled. Flights were full. We have a scenario now that we are trying to use a conventional policy in an extremely unique economic situation where 2/3 of our foreign exchange is cut off. I heard Senator Grant earlier say, on average, we see about 20,000 people coming into the island per week. Seats coming into the island. We're looking at 2,000. So the situation is very, very different. Sir, when you talk about capital works projects, the money will go to two places. Primarily, it will go to wages for the persons it employs, And we know that they will consume goods and services and they will spend their money. And the other side, it will go to profits. Construction companies, cleaning companies, and the like. But the problem there, Mr. President, is that one, on the wages side, when those people consume goods and services, 80% of every dollar that is spent in Barbados goes into imports. On the profit side, none of the firms that will engage in the capital works are innovators or those that will seek to reinvest in any innovative projects. And that is the trajectory that we know. Sir, and although the argument can be made that we have approximately, I believe it is now $1.8 billion in foreign exchange, in foreign reserves, the fact that the tourism industry is cut off to the point where we are now blind to when it will return, we need to be more cautious on how we spend capital works money. Sir, I also take the note and issue and the concern that Senator Moore raised earlier today, this afternoon. So you have a situation where government is taking from the public sector and placing it into the hands of possibly a few construction firms, where only yesterday their grievances were being aired in terms of the workers of the construction industry, and a national newspaper carried a headline, "Strike Threat." So you're asking public sector workers to invest money into a situation that is clearly volatile when it comes to labor relations. I am not an expert. I wouldn't claim to be. I am just going on what I see in the media. Sir, I want to quote to you what that article stated. A union representative in the article said, if you allow me to, sir, you had a COVID shutdown, so you may have to have a workers' shutdown. He's explicit. He said, sir, further, owners of construction companies in Barbados were treating their employees unfairly on the back of wages cuts, and he suggested that the company in question and its affiliate companies are likely to bid, gets interesting here, sir, are likely to bid for hundreds of houses which government recently advertised seeking bids. And we have a government saying to public workers and to the country, we need money to put into these firms to get economic activity going. Yet the workers are saying we are not benefiting in any significant way. So remember I said there were two places which this money will go, wages and profits. So if the workers are saying it's not going in wages, then sir, where will it go